when I started taking auctions a long time ago, one was always very worried because my father was an auctioneer and he would only allow me to take sales at the end of farm sales. So I'd stand on a plastic bucket and sell the last 50 lots, which inevitably was the contents of a kitchen or some outside slum, where everything would sell for, in pounds, shillings and pence, £0.50 was my favourite bid. Anyway, you knew you got to the end of the sale because there'd be 3 old biddies all eating crisps somewhere in this outside shed, and that was the moment that you know you'd really got everybody's attention. Anyway, so tonight's talk is Auctions, Anecdotes and Awful Moments. For those of you who know anything about me, you'll know that I'm an auctioneer by profession, that I started, as I say, at the tender age of about 12, and I've loved it ever since. And one's been very fortunate to have that skill, that partly, I guess, was inherited from my father and my grandfather. But being able to translate that into something in the fine art world, as opposed to an agricultural practice in the West Country, which is what my parents had, I have indeed been very fortunate. But tonight, I'm going to show you a few slides, if I can get this gadget to work. And for those of you of a certain age, you will recognize that this is a single sheet of Bronco lavatory paper. It's not terribly clear, so I put it on a light box. And the amazing thing I find in my life is that people send me things unsolicited in the post. And I opened up this letter and there was a sheet of Bronco in the letter, which has got this lovely sketch on it, as you can see. I thought, what the heck's going on here? Anyway, lovely man had written to me because he liked in the television program that I used to do when it was a close match between the contestants. I would say there's hardly a sheet of Bronco between you, which for those in my audience who know about such things, they rather like that turn of phrase. Anyway, this particular gentleman liked it sufficiently because he opened up a book, he told me in the accompanying letter, that he hadn't looked at for at least 60 years. And when he was in Africa, they used to issue Bronco lavatory paper in the colonial service. And he did a tracing of those birds in Tanganyika 60 years before. He found this tracing and he was so moved having found a piece of Bronco that he'd put pencil on, he thought he'd send it to me so that I could frame it and put it in my lavatory. Anyway, I thought tonight's talk ought to start from the bottom up. They say about auctioneers that there is a sense of drama and performance about what they do, and if they're any good as auctioneers, in order to arrest attention and to drive the price ever higher, there is a degree of theatricality. Anyway, I went to a single-sex school, not a terribly posh one, but it was a boarding school. And being a single-sex school and being in the first form, you were inevitably likely to be selected to play a female lead in the school production. So the girl on the right is me, Kitty Verdon in Charlie's Aunt. And I thought I did a particularly fine job. Moving on to the following year, of course, biology takes its effect. And here I am in The Winslow Boy, where I played an incredible role as Violet the maid. My chums at school called me Violent the maid, because I got quite keen on rugby by then, and I'd kind of filled out a bit. But nevertheless, I got away with it as Violent the maid that year. Moving on, we have here a man called Sergeant Mitchum, which is me, cleaning my Sten gun in a delightful set, by which time the hormonal balance had been redressed and I was back in my proper gender. Are we allowed to talk about genders these days? Perhaps not. What got me going in the antiques business, I'd gone to the V&A and done a study centre course, which was run by a marvellous woman, some of you may remember her, who'd been at the Courtauld. She was called Erica O'Donnell. And by a very strange coincidence, 3 months ago, my goddaughter married a Polish gentleman, a lovely boy called Nick. And when her father gave her away and made his speech, he said, the only way I can remember what this Polish name is of the person that my daughter's married is if I relate it to Kiss Your Left Ski. So this girl is now Mrs. Kiss Your Left Ski, and Mr. Kiss Your Left Ski came to speak to me after the wedding ceremony, and he said, you used to know my mother. I said, did I? I don't remember ever knowing anybody called Kiss Your Left Ski. Anyway, he said you did, and she used to teach you at the V&A. I said, that's not the case. There was a very nice girl called Erica O'Donnell there in 1969 or whatever it was. And he said, yes, that's my mother, because my father was Polish and my mother stuck to her Irish name, and that was that little confusion. Anyway, as this girl was a very fond goddaughter of mine, and she said she was going to buy an 18-karat gold watch for her beloved fiancé, I thought I'd give her rather a nice gold guard chain. So I splashed out a bit more than I'd normally splash out on this girl, and I was so delighted that I had, because of course Erica O'Donnell, who accepted me with very few academic qualifications onto her scheme at the V&A, removed the scales from my eyes. She taught us to look up when you walk down a street, question what a moulding is, how is something made, how can you possibly say that that's 200 years old when it looks as if it might be 20 years old, to question things and look at them properly, which was the great thing about Erica O'Donnell. Anyway, having finished at the V&A, this man, who some of you may recognize as David Batty, David Batty was the managing director of a sale room in Mottcombe Street in London, to whom I applied one day for a job. And the lovely thing about Sotheby's in Mottcombe Street was that it only dealt in Victorian art and objects. And that's the first job that I had at Sotheby's, and my jobs at Sotheby's lasted for the next 25 years. Early on, I started doing European travel. This Maigret-like, brilliant black and white photograph shows me with a woman called Alicia Peel, who ran Sotheby's office in Madrid, which is one of the offices across Europe that I opened. And I like to think that the gitan in her left hand is very typical of a Sotheby's representative looking after the royal family in Spain. And I'm about to go out with my notepad, which is what we used to do in the old days, to do a bit of evaluation. Later, I started visiting India a lot. I went to India with Sotheby's every year for a month for about 10 years, and started developing a taste and a knowledge for European works of art. And those visits to India, and I was just talking to one of the guests a little earlier about what it was like to go Maharaja bashing in the 1980s. You go to Rajasthan, Mrs. Gandhi had taken away the privy purse from the royal households across India in the late 70s. That meant that their annuity, the money that came to the Indian royal families, all 647 of them, was cut off. And if they had a palace that they could convert into a hotel, if they got some property asset that they could make into a business, then they survived. If they didn't have that, because there wasn't a handy airport, they weren't in Rajasthan, they were in some tucked away remote part, then they inevitably thought about selling some of their works of art. And of course, these princes in the 18th century, and particularly the 19th century, bought extensively in Europe. And therefore, for a person like me, who had knowledge in European works of art and horology and a variety of object-led subjects, this is a great place to visit. And the reason I wanted to show you this clock, it exemplifies to me the mystery that must have seized so many Eastern potentates. When you get a sophisticated work of art which is made, this is made of onyx, basically the case of this mantle timepiece is onyx. It's gilt bronze in the Rococo manner, which is the banding that you see applied on the Bombay shape, these lovely curved sides and whatnot. It's got a movement which tells you the time in an insignificant way on the white enamel dial, but the amazing thing about it is that the thing was made with a clockwork motor in the base that is connected to a series of rods that goes up each of those pillars, so that each of the finials, which are encrusted in pearl and diamonds and rubies and emeralds, those floral arrangements, when you get to the hour of 12 o'clock or whatever it may be, and it goes ding, 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 ding for 12, each of those revolve, which is the most extraordinary thing. And you got them on rather weird rhinoceros cast bases. This is something that was made in London in the 1770s, and the 1770s were a high point in British horology, and if you went out east and you made a diplomatic gift and you presented something like this to one of those potentates, they would not have seen anything like it in their lives. And it was this mystery, this fascination with sophisticated objects coming from the West that were arriving in these places that cemented trade deals. And who knows, the trade deals that led to annexing large chunks of some of these nations may all have started from the presentation of works of art. That's a little detail of how this rod business would come upper post and do its revolution. Having started my career at Sotheby's and done all this overseas travel, I finished up as, I didn't finish up, I became chairman of Sotheby's sale room in Sussex. And this is the mansion house in Somers Place, just outside Billingshurst, with 110 people who worked in that sale room. It was an extraordinary experience heading that team, because the specialists had an immensely broad knowledge of their subject. They were real all-round experts, sieving and sorting all manner of objects which came to them from Sotheby's regional sale rooms and regional offices that would send their goods to Sussex for cataloguing and sale. I loved it. And one of the things that you get a particular excitement from are rare discoveries. And this is a bronze figure that was brought in to Sotheby's in Sussex by a sweet old couple who were retiring from their bungalow in Worthing. They'd had a terrible time selling this bungalow in Worthing. This is in the 1980s. And as people who sell properties and have a really bad time selling them find out, they get so cross by the time you've had 4 failed people who've offered to buy, have let you down, have reduced the price, have done all sorts of foul things to you. And if you're elderly and about to go to your nursing home in Bournemouth, you get really cross. Anyway, there was a really horrible man who ultimately bought their bungalow in Worthing. And so typically, they stripped everything out of the bungalow. They took all the lavatory paper holders, they took the light switches, they took the cupboards, they took all the things from this house. And just as they were leaving, the old lady said, "What about that bronze figure in the goldfish pond at the bottom of the garden?" He said, "I can't take that, it's all concreted in." She said, "Never mind, break the concrete up and we'll take it to Sotheby's." And this thing is about 2'6" high, covered in guano. It's been in their goldfish pond for the last 37 years, which is when they bought the house. It came with the goldfish pond. A very nice person at Sotheby's, smart, young, in a suit, said, "This is a 19th century copy and it's worth £1,000 to £1,500. They said, "Marvellous, that's 1,000 to 1,500 that the purchaser won't get, that rotten fellow." And they shoved off to Bournemouth. Anyway, Sotheby's Renaissance art specialist happened to be in Sussex, and this girl called Lizzie Wilson looked at this thing and said, this ain't some 19th century copy. This is by a man called De Vries. It was probably sculpted and cast in 1680, and it's worth between £600,000 and £800,000. Can you imagine a telephone call to the nursing home in Bournemouth? We've looked at your bronze again, and we've decided that we slightly undercooked it at 1,000 to 1,500. All the standard auctioneer guff comes out, but we'll do our very best with it, and we'll sell it in our London sale rooms. So naturally, the retirees in Bournemouth are very happy about this, and that's indeed what happened. And if you're in a sale room when something extraordinary is about to happen, there is quite an atmosphere, you know, something that's never been seen or is rarely on the market, something that's exquisitely made, something that is demanding every attention possible from serious collectors. And it was just like that the day in 1989 in Bond Street when I was there for the sale of this figure. And to cut a long story short, this figure made £6.8 million. Imagine the next telephone call to Bournemouth. Anyway, it's rather sweet because they were going to be presented with a £2 or £3 million capital gains tax bill, so they decided that they'd give up on Bournemouth and go and live in Monte Carlo, which is probably the best thing that you could possibly do. Discoveries in other areas, for those of you who like a bit of furniture, who like a bit of late 19th century Art Nouveau inspired furniture, you'd like this bed and the bedside cupboard. When at a firm like Sotheby's in the old days you get a call and somebody says, I have a bedroom suite that I would like to sell, you're not normally in your car driving to Southport with the greatest of speed. But this was a bedroom suite that I found in a house in Southport, and it turned out to be by this man, who's a French eminent cabinet maker called Louis Margerel, this lovely old boy captured in a painting that's now in the Louvre. This was the double bed, this extraordinary and beautiful organic wardrobe, 3 bedroom chairs, a couple of bedside cabinets with extremely finely cast bronze. This is cast bronze of the best quality, and this grows up the side of the wardrobe, and you get sprouting at the top, which you can see, going the wrong way, you can see in the top of that slide how this organic form reaches to the sky. Anyway, in the old days, Sotheby's had sale rooms everywhere. There's a sale room in Monte Carlo. We send the bedroom suite to Monte Carlo, the one that came from the bungalow in Southport, and lo and behold, this is before the euro, this thing makes 1.8 million francs. Typical of that sort of object at that sort of time. If we go forward, some of the sales at Sotheby's were highly amusing. I catalogued out of the Elton John collection a whole catalogue. There were 5 catalogues in the Elton John sale, one of which was called Phantasmagoria. And we had in the Bond Street set of sale rooms no less than 5 rooms linked up with radios and telephones so that we all could understand what was being bid by this vast number of people who were on the premises. Anybody recognize him? Edward Heath, very grumpy man, but nevertheless inspired to come to the Elton John sale. Anybody recognize those? The boots that Elton wore in Tommy that actually made something like £7,500. The TV thing for me started with the Antiques Roadshow, and this is a group of Antiques Roadshow experts at a dinner in the Mansion House. There's a cross-section of faces that, if you were close enough, you would recognize. A lot of people say to me, well, how did you start off doing the Antiques Roadshow? I got a call and an invitation to go to a place called Newcastle Emlyn in the middle of Wales. And I said, what do you want me to do? And they said, well, we would like you to come as an observer. And I said, well, who's observing who? You observing me, or am I observing you? And she said, well, there's a bit of both, really. But come to the hotel, the Antiques Roadshow Hotel in Newcastle Emlyn, for the dinner before the day of the recordings, which I did. And I found my old friend John Bly propping up the bar. He'd unfortunately broken his leg in Cornwall when walking with Hugh Scully. So he was wounded, but nevertheless holding forth in good state. My friends Paul Atterbury, Hilary Kay, Bunny Campione, all these people from the Antiques Roadshow were in this hotel enjoying their fare in preparation for the filming of the roadshow. And I went down to Newcastle Emlyn bright and early to look at the furniture that they gathered from clients who were unable to actually bring those larger pieces in. And at about 9:15, just as they were about to open, a production person came to me and said, I'm terribly sorry, Tim, but you know about furniture, don't you? I said, I do. She said, well, John Bly has fallen down the steps at the front of the hotel and he's broken his other leg. I said, oh dear. That's unfortunate. And they said, well, would you mind being the furniture expert today? And I said, well, that's fine. And I'd gone from observer to number one man in 2 ticks. That was all right. But after an hour and a half, who should appear at the back of this hall? The doors are flung open, but John Bly appears with 2 broken legs. Let nobody say that the Antiques Roadshow experts aren't competitive. He wasn't going to have some whippersnapper take his job on the show. So they said to me, would you mind going and doing what you do on the miscellaneous table? I said, what's the miscellaneous table? They said, well, that's the place where all the unusual things that the other experts don't know about. And I said, is it a euphemism for crap? And they said, possibly. But all my friends were there. That's where Campione and Atterbury and Mark Allam and all those people hang out, because it is the most difficult area to perform in because of the variety of oddball things that appear. And before the internet, which is when I guess one's expertise was tested most, it was certainly a difficult arena. But very early on, a woman came in. She was quite Welsh, and she said she had something to look at, and she looked very delectable in one of those orange shell suits. She unwrapped a little box, and inside was a golf ball. I said, that's a golf ball. She said, I know it's a golf ball. She said, I don't want to know what it's worth. She said, I just want to know all about it. I thought, oh dear, we've got a very difficult one here. This is my first time doing this. But I think she's so difficult, I'll go and get a film crew, which was my wisest thing. So I got the camera chaps over. I said, I want you to record what this woman says. I said, what did you just say to me? She said, I don't want to know. She said, what it's worth. I just want to know all about it. So I thought, right, I'll tell you all about it. And I told her all about it. I told her it was an extremely early golf ball called a feathery that was made in the 18th century by ramming goose down wet into a chamois leather bag, waiting for the goose down to dry out, where it becomes extremely hard because it can't escape from the chamois leather bag. And then you sew goat skin on the outside. And if you've got a really rare 18th century feathery golf ball, you stamp it with its weight, silver weight in ounces and pennyweights, and then you put the name of the maker on it. Anyway, this golf ball had all this lot on it, and I told her, I droned on for hours and hours telling her how wonderful her golf ball was, until she said the magical words, which were, is it worth anything? Because she started out by saying she didn't want to know what it was worth, and then I told her it was worth 15,000 to 20,000 pounds, whereupon, we're talking about 1988 money, she then fell backwards in the queue against a man who had a double bass, who then fell, it was the most marvellous domino effect. It was the best thing the BBC had seen in years on an Antiques Roadshow, and they asked me to go back the following year and do some more. Anyway, that's some of these antiques experts. One year on the Antiques Roadshow, so politically incorrect was the BBC at the time that they awarded me the Saga Magazine Award for Euthanasia, because I was the only expert on the Antiques Roadshow who ever had a member of the public die when they were being filmed. It was in a place called Market Harborough, and it was a very cold day, and this nice old boy had been queuing up for a while, and they advanced him up the queue because they thought he wasn't looking terribly well. Anyway, he sat down in front of me and he got a gramophone, one of those cylinder gramophones, and I wound up the gramophone and I put the record on, because that's what you do for the telly, and it all makes it very nice and entertaining. I asked him where he got it from. He said he got it from the Sergeant's Mess in Biggin Hill, which is a station that he'd served on, and he'd had it for 45 years. And the record that was playing was, "Oh, what a marvellous day," lovely Edwardian tune. Whereupon this man, I thought, bent forward to pick up a bit of fluff off the floor. He didn't pick up the fluff off the floor, he fell to the floor and died at my feet. And the cameras were running, and some director says, "Cut!" And of course the BBC have a system where screens are produced, and the decent thing is done by this poor person who'd had this terrible thing happen to them. But all the wags on the show, the old riggers, they come up to me and say, "Tim, we know what programme you're going to do next." I say, "What's that?" He said, "Till death us do part. One foot in the grave." All that sort of ribaldry. Was I asked if I'd like counselling or anything like that? No way, nothing like that. Just crack on after a cup of tea and do some more valuations. And that's how it was in 1996. And in the Christmas party that year, I get my certificate, which I still have, the Saga Magazine Award for Euthanasia. I promise you, the BBC would not produce a certificate like this these days. Life has changed. Gilly Goulden in something called The Great Antiques Hunt, that was the one with the bloodhounds. Here I am peddling her around Cambridge. Griff Rhys-Jones hosted a program called Restoration, which was obviously to do with the restoration of buildings. And for the first series, celebrities, D-list celebrities, were asked to select a building to champion. And this is the building that I selected, which is a corn mill in Lincolnshire. Happens to be the tallest corn mill in Lincolnshire, tallest corn mill in England, surviving corn mill in England. It's just missing its sales, and that's what the restoration programme was all about, raising the money that would make those sales come back and make it back into a working corn mill, which is what happened at the end of the programme. But I was not savvy enough to realise, because I was given the opportunity of picking any building. I could have had the Manchester swimming baths. If I'd thought about it, the population of Manchester, with potential people to vote for the restoration of a building, is, whatever it is, 3 million in Greater Manchester. The population of this village in Lincolnshire, where this corn mill is, about 237. So I'm afraid I didn't win that competition. But it was interesting and fun to do. And I remember a marvellous moment when they had the denouement in the Tower of London. My driver was driving me into the Tower of London. There's a sort of undercroft that you go by, and in a sort of kiosk by the side of the road running security, there's a beefeater in his full fig asking you for ID. And he had his intercom on, his mobile phone, because one of the other judges was Ulrika Johnson, and it was a marvellous sight because over the tannoy between these chaps and in the kiosk said, "Hey, Fred, come over here. Ulrika's running up this, Ulrika's driving in." And there were about 4 beefeaters running up a slope so that they could get somewhere near this woman, which was too silly for words, really. Ready, steady, cook. If you ever do ready, steady, cook, never cook meat. No, sorry, never cook fish. I cooked fish, but the meat eaters always win, statistically. This is a photograph that relates to the Paul Atterbury on the left, Hilary Kay, Jill Dando, me and Lars Tharp. This relates to a marvellous series that we made called The Antiques Inspectors. And this is a 20-part series. The Sunday of the last filming day, which had been in the Isle of Man, we all go and say goodbye and get on our aeroplanes and go back to wherever we go back to. On the Monday morning, Jill Dando was murdered outside her flat in Fulham. And I cannot tell you what an extraordinary experience that was for me, because you get quite close to people. I mean, it's an artificial world, sure. But Jill Dando was an extremely lovely person. And for her to be so cruelly taken and in those terrible circumstances was a really serious shock, and one felt absolutely poleaxed by all of this, even for an old toughie like me. But the BBC were marvellous. They rented a Thames River barge, one of those big old jobs with a sail. They made us, they asked us, all the people who'd been on this production, about 3 weeks after her funeral, to go to Tower Bridge and get onto this sailing vessel. And we sailed down the Thames one glorious Friday afternoon, and we had lunch. And they provided all the hospitality for just our little team. Nothing to be filmed, nothing to be recorded, nothing to talk to anybody much about, but just for us to go over what we had experienced in the previous 6 weeks with her, which was really rather a lovely thing to do. Objects which come one's way in the auction business in peculiar circumstances. This is a picture by the celebrated Flemish artist Van Os. It was a picture that was produced for me to look at Sotheby's from a man who lived on Anglesey in Beaumaris. And I'd known this man for a long time. He was a dealer. He had a shop in Llandudno. And one of the peculiar things that I always found about Wartski of London's jewellery business is, if you look at Wartski's early correspondence, they had the retail outlet in Old Bond Street and in Llandudno. And Llandudno may be a smashing place, but it's hardly the epicenter of anything that you'd think that Wartski's might want to have an association with. And when I found this picture, which came from this dealer in Beaumaris, he explained to me why this was. His grandfather had cut the stone, the Koh-i-Noor stone. He was an Amsterdam Jewish gem cutter. He'd been invited to London in the 1880s to cut the stone. He'd cut the stone, which is significantly bigger, but nevertheless, it took him 5 years to do it. And at the end of that process, Queen Victoria gave him the Victorian Order, and that entitled him and his family in successive generations to become British citizens. And when Adolf Hitler appeared on the horizon of the Low Countries, his father left Holland, left the diamond cutting business there, and finished up in North Wales in Llandudno. And that's because the British government had a secret diamond cutting works in the Great Orme, which is the large, it's a lump of rock, rather like Gibraltar, not as big as Gibraltar, but anyway, a rock within which there were subterranean passages that the British government cut industrial diamonds secretly in the Second World War. And that's why his father, who was also a diamond cutter, came and lived in Llandudno, and that's how they started their dealing business up there. But one of the things that they brought out of Holland at the beginning of the Second World War was this picture. So it has a little memory of a place. Associations with people are forever important. If you could read this, you'd see that it says 10 Downing Street, and it's a cigar stub. And of course, it's a cigar stub that belonged to Winston Churchill. The cigar stub is dated, the letter is dated the 22nd of August 1941. So, we're in the height of the Second World War. This is Winston Churchill writing a letter in 1941 in August to a friend of his, sending him a memento, which is a half-smoked cigar. What's this worth? Well, we're in the auction business, aren't we? It's worth what two people are prepared to pay for it. So a 70-year-old Churchillian cigar stub appearing at auction with this little letter, is it worth £500? Is it worth £5,000? Or is it worth the £6,500 that it actually brought at auction? That's the fun part of the business. What do these look like? A pair of dentures. Unusual dentures because they are carved ivory. The very best dentures from the First World War were carved of ivory. The back is gold. It has a peculiar shape to the plate that would fit in your mouth because the person who owned these teeth had a speech impediment, and that too was Winston Churchill. Because he had this famous lisp, his dentist, a Harley Street dentist, constructed this appliance to go in his mouth in a way that would reduce his propensity to lisp when he's giving his public speeches. How does a thing like this survive? Well, he had two pairs. One pair went back for repair. The dentist kept them. The dentist wrote a little script as to how he got these teeth, and when they appeared at Bonham's in one of their extraordinary sales a couple of years ago, a set of dentures just happened to make £27,000, which is pretty well mad, really. Now, we've got to 20 to 7. I'm going to look at mine host. Would you like another spiel, Brett, or have you had enough and want to get some more champagne? One more spiel? Why not? This is a man called William Hesketh Lever, who was the founder of Lever Brothers and ultimately became Viscount Leverhulme. This is the Sunlight Soap Works on the banks of the River Mersey, which were established by Lever, who discovered that all soap in the middle of the 19th century was completely useless. You couldn't get any lather out of it. They made it out of rendered animal fat. What he discovered was the addition of palm oil to the normal soap ingredients transformed the product, and he started his business from a humble grocery business in Bolton. Leverhulme started making soap big time on the banks of the Mersey and translated that into a huge fortune that ultimately became the multinational Unilever that we know today. That enabled him to build this marvellous house, which is called Thornton Hough. And when I worked at Sotheby's, one's dream ticket was to get involved in a major country house sale, do something where an enormous collection came together at any one time. You put up 5 marquees, link them all up, acres of that rather cheap carpeting, into which you would thrust all these works of art. And the Thornton Hough Leverhulme sale was one of the Sotheby's sales that I was involved in. Now, Lord Leverhulme had peculiar sleeping habits. He liked to sleep out of doors, and this is a fold in the roof of that magnificent house that he lived in. He liked fresh air. This was how his bedroom would have looked in 1910 or 1920. He was known to have been awoken with snow on the counterpane of his bed. He felt that fresh air was good for you. And he did live to a ripe old age. He also liked to furnish in styles. This is something that they call the Adams style room. This magnificent ballroom was furnished in the Christopher Wren style, and actually when we went to Thornton Hough to do the cataloguing, it wasn't so very different from this period photograph. He was a master of advertising and promotion for his soap business. This is a painting by W.F. Gore that when Gore painted it and exhibited it at the Royal Academy, it had a title which was Naughty Girl. The girl has spilt the ink on her book, and the dog is looking at her in a typically sentimental Victorian genre painting as in an admonishing way, and she's holding her finger up. So Leverhulme buys this picture and immediately it retitles it as "Oh So Clean." He then takes the image and makes it into a calendar, which he produces hundreds of thousands of copies of, that goes out as a prize for people who buy enough Sunlight Soap. They get enough tokens, they can have the calendar for the year. So he'd take a work of art and he'd translate it into something which is going to promote his business. This is a table full of the silver. The section of the sale that I took at Thornton Hough was the silver. And if you're able to kind of grip how Edwardian households worked, where you have all these silver accoutrements for passing asparagus, for toasting cheese, for putting your celery in, for doing 1,000,001 domestic and dining operations, all had silver accoutrements to go with them. And this sale included the entire gamut of what you might have had in a wealthy man's house in the 1910-1920 period. There were something like 380 lots of silver, and I was to take that section of the sale. Now, it's quite a lot to sell, but on the other hand, I'd done it for years. They said, "Do you want a relief auctioneer?" I said, "I don't want a relief auctioneer, I'll just crack on with it." The tent has 1,000 people in it with 1,000 paddles. This Leverhulme family are incredibly popular locally because they never moved away. They didn't go to Shropshire and live. They didn't go and live in London. They continued living on the Wirral in Thornton Hough, which meant that every good burger from Liverpool who fancied buying something that related to the Leverhulme family would turn up and spend his ill-gotten gains getting a prize which would remind them of how wonderful this family had been in that locality. When I got to the last 20 or 30 lots, the clerk said to me, he said, "If you keep this up," he said, "you'll do it." I said, "Oh, get away, I won't." Get to the last couple of lots, and suddenly behind the rostrum, some of the 40 Sotheby's staff start to gather, because when I sold the final lot, each of the lots had sold, and there had been no unsold lots, which is something that's called a white glove sale. And the managing director of Sotheby's presented me with a pair of white gloves to say, "Congratulations, you've sold all this silver and not one single lot is unsold," which out of 350 odd lots is quite something. Before I finish, I'm going to share with you some of the letters that get sent to people like me occasionally, and we have a very nice woman from Glasgow who says, "Bargain hunt is wonderful. I think it's simply topping. When I know the show is on, I hurry with my shopping. Not so much the bargains, they don't seem to matter. You're the star of the show. I love to hear your chatter." She's clearly gifted by the bard. This one from Australia says, my partner Janet and I have travelled extensively in the UK and Europe, during which time we've enjoyed the television programmes Bargain Hunt, Antiques Roadshow and Basil Brush. Until recently, I was convinced you were the voice behind Basil, and even now I find it difficult to believe that Boom Boom is not you. I am a Dutch viewer, not all these letters are great, and watch Bargain Hunt every day. May I express my compliments to you as the best programme maker I have ever seen. Living in the Netherlands, our television programmes are of such poor quality, it is wonderful to see how you manage to make this programme suitable for experts and ordinary people. I sincerely hope that you may keep on making this programme for many, many years. Yours sincerely, Germaine Wind Verburg, aged 51. Watch out. Good afternoon, Mr. Wonnacott. Don't you think it's time you visited a dentist? Well, I think, yes, it is. You have an awful look, in my opinion. I really can't believe that all the BBC watchers like it. I do not. T. Drock, Holland. And finally, on a jollier note, we love Bargain Hunt programme on BBC One, but hate it with you as the so-called presenter. Hell, you don't half fancy yourself. Don't you know it's so rude to speak to a person and not look at them? You're constantly looking at the camera. It's not as if you're even handsome. Maybe you don't realise you're doing it. Mind you, I expect you finish the programme and immediately look at yourself. Your pronunciation of off comes out as orf. You are such a twat. You and Carol Vorderman are the two most irritating people on television. The sad thing is, the program is great, but we can't stand the sight of you. You develop a certain thickness to your skin, and once you've developed it, you're unlikely to be hurt by a lot. Never explain, never complain. This lovely person wrote from Australia, "Dearest Tim, I'm feeling very lonely. Winter is almost here. I wish I could cuddle up to you. I haven't been near any man for 28 years. I feel very lonely at times. My age makes no difference. I'd very much like to cuddle up to you. I love you very much, Tim. I'd like to shower with you and cuddle up with you in crispy white sheets and go to sleep. I'm really crazy about you. Age makes no difference. I'm letting you know my thoughts. I honestly have terrific feelings towards you. Lots of love, Trevor." Perhaps that's why I go to Australia so much. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, forgive me for reducing the tone of Timeline's addresses, but I've rather enjoyed it, and I hope you have too. Anyway, good night, enjoy the view.